While most kids her age were still learning to sound out words or playing in schoolyards, Alma lived a quieter life. She fixed broken radios, sketched circuit designs in an old notebook, and rode the city bus with her mother to a towering tech building where her mom worked night shifts as a janitor. No one knew Alma was there every evening. No one saw her. To everyone, she didn't exist. Except one day, everything changed. A massive cyber attack suddenly halted the entire company. Systems failed, screens went black, and panic set in. But the only person who truly understood what was happening wasn't an engineer, wasn't an executive. It was Alma, and when she quietly asked if she could help, what followed was something no one expected. How could a forgotten girl be the only person who could fix everything? And what happens when someone with real power finally notices someone they'd never seen before? Stay with us. This is the story of how genius grows in silence, and how everything changes the moment someone decides to really see. Alma always walked exactly 6 steps behind her mother. No one told her to do that. She just liked watching how her mum moved through spaces that never quite felt like hers. Her mother never rushed. She never made direct eye contact. She didn't pretend to belong in the polished hallways of Verdant Technologies. She moved like she was invisible, and that was the point. Alma had learned from a young age that not being noticed could be a kind of power, especially in places where people thought you didn't belong. She clutched her old, battered backpack tighter, careful not to let the broken zipper snag her hoodie. Inside were her most precious things: her notebook, an old digital watch that no longer ticked, and a shattered USB drive she refused to throw away. When they entered through the employee side entrance, the guard didn't look at her. He never really did. One word from her mother. 37 was all it took. It meant same floor, same shift. It meant they belonged for now. Alma said nothing. She walked to her usual spot, a quiet chair in the far corner of the lobby. Her legs dangled above the floor as she flipped open her notebook, turning back through sketches of circuits and mock code until she found a blank page and began to draw again. This was her favorite part of the day, the moment she could imagine that for a little while she belonged here too. Her mum was gone now, past the service elevators. Alma was already deep in designing an imaginary motherboard that could send signals to phones without any wires. Her pencil moved fast, following the trail of thoughts rushing through her mind. She barely noticed the people passing by, the clack of heels on marble, the whispered urgency of hallway conversations, or the tapping of tablet covers. All of that disappeared. What mattered was her idea, a wireless device that could pick up broken signals and decode them. She'd seen something like it once on a YouTube video she wasn't supposed to be watching. The details were blurry now, but the idea stuck. She wasn't just drawing the board. She began to imagine the code too, her own secret language, made of strange symbols and numbers only she could understand. Then something strange happened. As she was writing a line of that imaginary code, the light above her flickered. She paused and blinked. In a split second, every screen in the room went black. It felt like dozens of eyes suddenly closed all at once. Alma was thrilled. Around her, the quiet murmurs shifted into sharp, alarmed voices. People pulled out their phones. Some were confused. Others were shouting. Then one word froze everything. Breach! The mood shifted instantly. A man near the reception desk slammed his tablet and barked into his headset, demanding to know why he was locked out. A woman in a sharp blazer rushed past, muttering something about remote commands and fail-safes. Alma didn't know the woman's title, but the way she moved told Alma everything. This was someone people listened to. A building that had seemed perfect just moments earlier was beginning to fracture. Alma didn't move. She knew that if anyone noticed her, they'd tell her to leave. So she stayed still, watching everything with wide eyes. A group of men near the elevators were arguing now. One of them said it was a kernel override. Another insisted it was malware. Alma knew that word. She'd read about malware. She'd watched videos of people simulating attacks on test systems. She hadn't understood everything, but the fear in their voices told her all she needed to know. She didn't panic. She observed. She learned. Someone nearby spoke sharply. "Not now. This can't be happening now." Alma looked up at the large screen above the front desk. Still black. She closed her eyes. What was special about today? A nervous young man in a blazer walked toward the windows, phone pressed to his ear. "She's going to kill us," he whispered. "This is our biggest client presentation of the year. We've already lost." Alma wrote the words "client presentation" next to her diagram. She didn't know why, but it felt important. This wasn't just a system crash. Something or someone was the target. She kept listening. The receptionist said they'd tried rebooting the local servers. It didn't work. Someone else said they tried pinging the external DNS. Still locked out. Alma gently tapped her pencil against the edge of her notebook. None of them seemed to know where the breach had started. They were all reacting blindly, trying the usual tricks, like opening doors that no longer existed. She stayed silent, flipped to a clean page, and started writing what she would have done. Step 1. Find the origin of the breach. Internal or external. Run a diagnostic shell. Scan for abnormal traffic patterns. She didn't know if she could fix it, but one thing became painfully clear. They couldn't. That realization hit her harder than she expected. The adults, people in suits with ID badges, looked completely lost, and for the first time in her life, something shifted inside Alma. This wasn't the usual curiosity she always carried. It was deeper, heavier, a quiet alarm in her chest, like she was holding a match an inch away from dry paper and knew the fire was coming. Alma never thought she could fix everything, but the way the others were fumbling reminded her of her cousin, once trying to connect an old hard drive to a TV, nearly resetting the entire system. Quietly, Alma had stepped in, plugged in her broken USB, rebooted the software. Instinct. No one had taught her how. She just figured it out, and now she was sitting in a room full of powerful people. People with access, resources, knowledge. But none of them had a starting point. None of them knew what to do next. Alma looked down at her notes. The lines and shapes on the page were starting to look real, like her mind was slowly reversing a tangled system, wiping away the chaos, step by step. She didn't need to see the code. She gripped her pencil. She hadn't planned to be here today, but now it felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Far above, faint alarms began to echo. Not emergency sirens, just warning tones. But Alma barely heard them. She was focused. Her hand moved faster across the page, connecting everything she heard with what she already understood. Kernel-level breach, system-wide lockdown, backup restore, failed. This wasn't a crash. It was a deliberate freeze. Someone had locked the network from the inside. It hadn't been deleted, just hidden. That meant the system was still intact, still reachable if you knew where to look. Alma took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid. The feeling inside her, the deep certainty, was just like the day she opened the old PC tower, left by a neighbor on the corner. Everyone said it was dead, but inside it still had life. It just needed a screwdriver, some time, and the freedom to explore without someone hovering over her. Now, while chaos spun around her, Alma felt something powerful. I understand this. She had never seen so many people who looked important, but the uncertainty in their eyes was clear. They gathered in a glass-walled conference room beside the main staircase. Some wore sharp business suits. Others had tech hoodies. A few were on their phones. Some stared helplessly at screens blinking red error codes. One monitor showed what looked like a global network map, but the only color was a deep, spreading red, like ink spilling through each node. Alma moved closer, quietly. Her old sneakers made no sound on the polished floor. She hugged her notebook tightly to her chest, studying the faces of people who were supposed to have all the answers. There was shouting, urgent whispers, nervous pacing. A tall man at the front slammed the table. "This isn't internal. It can't be internal," he yelled. "We hardened that pathway after Zurich," a woman replied firmly. "If that's true, then this is Ghost Protocol," added another. "It's mimicking normal user activity, too precise for brute force." Alma didn't understand every word, but she understood what was missing from their questions. They were asking the wrong ones. The room was in disarray, not just tense, but scared. Alma watched a technician typing furiously, trying to trigger a manual override, but each attempt was denied by cascading rejection codes. "Locked again," she muttered. "Level 4 encryption loop," someone said. "Who would do this?" another asked bitterly. "Who really doesn't want us online?" A man with silver threads in his hair, clearly used to giving orders, turned and shouted down the hallway. "Does anyone know where Edward is? We need master override." An assistant froze. "He's on a call, or he was upstairs in the boardroom." Alma understood what that meant. Whatever this was, it had spread fast. No one was steering the ship anymore, and in that one moment, Alma forgot she was supposed to be invisible. She took a step forward, and before she could stop herself, the words came out soft, but clear. "Have you considered a socket overflow loop?" It was like dropping a pebble into a still lake. Silence. Heads turned. Someone sneered. "What did she say?" Another exhaled hard. "Great, a kid got lost in here." But one woman didn't laugh. She stared. She didn't dismiss Alma. She looked at her calm, quiet, and deeply thinking. For several seconds, no one moved. Alma's face flushed red. Regret came fast and sharp. She'd broken her rule. Stay invisible, stay silent. She stepped back, already picturing the panic on her mother's face if someone realized she had wandered into restricted space. She clutched her notebook tighter, ready to disappear, pretend she was never there. But before she could vanish completely, she noticed someone else watching her. Not with annoyance, not with ridicule, with focus. He stood apart from the others, just a few years older than Alma, maybe. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't typing, he wasn't pacing in circles like the rest. He was just watching. His name tag read, Ronald. Alma looked at him, but quickly looked down again. Not before she caught the slight tilt of Ronald's head, as if he was turning her words over in his mind. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't judging. He was trying to understand. Alma felt something stir in her chest, a strange blend of fear, and something dangerously close to hope. She hadn't spoken randomly. The words had come from experience. She'd seen this kind of loop before hidden in a simulation she'd accessed through a cracked program she wasn't supposed to be using. She'd sat on the cold floor, long past midnight, a broken keyboard in her lap, hacking a test environment just for fun. It wasn't theory, it was muscle memory. In the glass-walled room, the older man who had laughed at her earlier was now pacing in circles. "We're playing blindfolded," he muttered. "This is a disaster," said another. "Every backdoor reset has failed." "We don't even know what we're dealing with," someone added, their voice tight with panic. "And Edward, when he sees the analytics crash on the investor dashboard, he's going to explode." Alma should have been scared by all of this, but in some strange way she wasn't. What unsettled her more was how far off their guesses were. Not just wrong, but completely disconnected from the real shape of the problem. They were searching for a brute force attack. But this was clean, controlled. Whatever broke into the system had slipped in quietly, perfectly blending into the background like it had always been there. Whoever did this knew the network better than the engineers who worked on it every day. Alma recognized the coding logic. She felt it in her bones. And the hardest part? She didn't know how to explain how she knew. That's the flaw in self-teaching. You understand things for which you don't yet have the right words. She opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. Inside the room, the arguments escalated. Some pushed for rapid action. Others panicked at the thought of making things worse. Then the woman who had hesitated earlier spoke up. "We should at least look into what she said," she said gently. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't shake. Someone scoffed. "Seriously? We're taking advice from a kid now." And that's when Ronald stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just said, "Her question makes sense." The room fell silent again. "It fits," he added, voice steady. "That's where I'd hide a recursive lockout, especially if I wanted it to look like a user error." He looked at Alma, then back at the room. "Let's not pretend we have a better lead." Silence. Alma swallowed hard. She didn't understand corporate politics, but she understood the way Ronald looked at her. It wasn't pity, it was belief. Maybe not complete trust, but a quiet recognition that could grow. She had slipped past the noise. Whether they liked it or not, she was no longer invisible. Alma stepped back slightly, unsure if she'd helped or only made things worse. The executives still looked skeptical. The techs kept moving, but the tone in the room had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to matter. Her voice had introduced a new idea, one that hadn't been there before, and that alone meant something. Alma slipped into the hallway and tucked herself behind a nearby column. From the shadows, she watched as the chaos resumed, but she could still feel Ronald's eyes on her, not judging, recognizing. She didn't look away. From the moment she spoke, Ronald hadn't turned his gaze. Calm in the middle of the frenzy, he was focused on her. He didn't smile, he didn't move, but he saw her now, like a missing puzzle piece sliding into place at the edge of the table. Alma sat on the floor just outside the room. She opened her notebook and wrote in large, sharp letters, "Socket, overflow, loop." If no one else was going to trace it, she would. She wasn't guessing. Letting Alma try wasn't really a decision anyone made. It wasn't about trust. It wasn't a plan. They let her try because they had nothing left. No more ideas. After so many failed attempts, the mood deflated into resignation. This was the moment that comes after defeat, when even those who were supposed to have all the answers just shrug. The lead IT technician, a tall man with fading hair and a dry sense of humor, muttered, "Well, why not? Maybe the janitor's kid can do what our whole department couldn't." There were a few chuckles, but they were hollow, tight, the kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. No one stopped her. No one expected much. They figured she'd sit, glance at the screen for a bit, maybe hit a few random keys. But Ronald stayed nearby. He hadn't said much since defending her in the meeting, but now he stepped up and gently pulled out a chair for her. "Here," he said softly. "You'll need to stand here. The desk's a little high." Alma shook her head. She hugged her notebook like a shield and climbed up without hesitation. She did it quietly and with confidence, the kind of courage that forms when you've faced teasing and learned how not to flinch. No one offered help. No one explained the system. She wasn't surprised. She looked at the terminal, eyes scanning the cluttered mess of tools and frozen text, and waited. Several seconds passed before she touched the keyboard. Her hands hovered not from uncertainty, but as she adjusted her sense of the layout, aligning her instincts with the hardware. The screen was a mess. Diagnostic tools frozen mid-process. Command prompts layered over locked admin files. Firewall blocks blinking with failed recovery attempts. She breathed slowly and evenly. She recognized the system enough to see that 3 separate backdoor entry attempts had already failed. This wasn't brute force. It was stealth, personal. Someone had slipped in so quietly, it was as if they were part of the system all along. She looked up not at the terminal, but just above it. On the shelf behind the screen was a photo, slightly tilted in its frame. Alma shifted her weight and focused. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, smiled while perched on someone's shoulders. Most of the man's face was cropped out, but his wristwatch was visible. The same one worn by the furious CEO who'd stormed through the building earlier. There was a tiny inscription at the bottom of the frame. Amelia, 4:00 a.m. Welcome to the world. Alma allowed herself a brief smile. Then she typed. For Amelia. There was no dramatic reaction, no alarms, no flashy graphics. Just a subtle shift. A new prompt appeared, one that hadn't been accessible before. Ronald, standing behind her, leaned in slightly. You just opened, but he didn't finish. Across the room, the sarcastic IT lead glanced up from his phone. The screen had frozen mid-scroll. He blinked. Wait, what was that? Alma didn't answer. She was already 2 steps deeper into the system, navigating it with ease like she'd rehearsed this. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check her notes. She wasn't guessing. She remembered. Her fingers danced across the keys, steady and calm. She moved through the system like it was familiar ground territory she'd walked before. An engineer leaned closer. That override wait, is that a fallback key? Another responded, frowning. We don't have any personal-based fallback in the admin stack. No one replied. Alma kept going. She didn't look up. She wasn't performing. She was just doing the work focused and deliberate, like she was listening to a song only she could hear. The mood in the room shifted. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it wasn't despair anymore either. It was disbelief, like watching a locked door swing open using a key everyone thought had been lost. All around her stood experts, technicians, engineers, people with years of experience watching a young girl move through a security maze they had built but couldn't bypass. Several long seconds passed. No one spoke. Only the soft tapping of Alma's fingers on the keyboard and the low hum of CPU fans filled the space. The woman who had stood up for her earlier stepped closer, eyes locked on the screen. She found the admin shell, she whispered. The IT lead squinted, trying to process what he saw. That shouldn't appear without clearance. Ronald nodded, still watching. She authenticated manually. Another voice said, she used the CEO's personal cipher. And then, silence again. Heavy. Real. They were all thinking the same thing. But no one wanted to say at first they'd missed something obvious. Not a software bug, not a hardware glitch, a human flaw. A CEO who had embedded a piece of his personal life into the company's security protocol. A man who once typed his daughter's name at 4 a.m. and unknowingly wove that moment into everything. And Alma, who had spent her whole life outside places like this, understood. Not because of luck, because she had learned to see the cracks in things, the kind no one else thinks to hide, because she had seen enough locked doors to know some weren't built to keep people out, not really. Ronald was the first to break the silence. He didn't speak to explain or interrupt. Instead, he quietly moved beside Alma and knelt next to her. You're inside the shell, he said gently. What are you looking for now? Alma didn't hesitate. The original loop, she said, her voice steady and clear. If I can trace the pattern of entry, I can reverse the lockout. Her fingers never slowed. She scanned system logs, error stacks, corrupted entries many disguised to appear harmless. But she wasn't fooled by appearances. She moved through digital traps like she'd been born to dismantle them. No one had trained her for this. No one had given her a manual or a degree. Her skill came from years of scavenging, fixing broken machines, sneaking into half-working bootloaders, decoding scrub tutorials from the forgotten corners of the internet. And now, here she was, doing what the experts couldn't. They were all standing behind her now, suddenly quiet, suddenly humble, watching a girl unravel the knots they'd spent years building. They had called it absurd, a joke, but now the joke was slowly revealing the truth, showing how thoroughly they had been fooled by their own blindness. They had overlooked the most important thing, and when Alma finally broke through the first layer of encryption, when the red warnings disappeared from one of the central monitors, and a new access window appeared. No one was laughing anymore. The news spread fast, not through official channels, but in whispers, nervous glances, and held breaths behind desks and near coffee machines. The janitor's kid was changing the system. It sounded ridiculous, like gossip that wasn't supposed to make it to the upper floors, but it reached him. Edward Soriano, CEO of Verdant Technologies, was walking silently across a small boardroom 2 floors up, his dark tablet in hand as the numbers continued to drop. Around him, his executive team scrambled to prepare an investor call full of sweetened data and frozen smiles. But Edward wasn't listening. He jabbed the screen harder with every failed refresh until he finally slammed the tablet against the table and turned on his assistant. "Why is the system still locked?" he snapped. The assistant, barely older than Ronald, hesitated. "There's someone working on it, sir." Edward narrowed his eyes. "Who?" The assistant faltered. A girl from the lobby. She's the daughter of one of the cleaners, I think." Edward froze. Then, without a word, he left the room and headed for the operations floor, a burning suspicion in his chest. Alma had no idea who Edward Soriano was, or that he was now standing behind the glass, watching her like a hawk circling a problem he couldn't decode. She didn't see him. She was locked in. The corrupted logs were peeling away in front of her like old thread. Each one revealed a hidden layer. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes narrowed, her body hunched the way it always did when she worked in the shadows, over broken machines. In corners no one looked. Her hands moved with silent urgency. Not because she was afraid, but because she had no time to be afraid. Every second of hesitation gave the breach more room to breathe. She was 3 layers deep in the shell now, moving without standard access tools, relying only on pattern recognition. Half the system diagnostics had been disabled by the attack. But Alma wasn't guessing anymore. She wasn't even looking at her notebook. She already held the system's logic in her head. And the logic of the hacker. It wasn't just code, it was a language, and she was fluent. On the other side of the glass, Edward crossed his arms. The doubt in his expression turned cold, calculated, almost belief but not acceptance. He stared at Alma, just a kid, wearing a baggy hoodie, sleeves rolled up, fingers typing softly on a machine built for seasoned professionals. He turned to one of the engineers nearby. "Call security," he said under his breath. The engineer hesitated. "Sir, she's just a kid." Edward replied flatly, "And this is a multi-million-dollar network. I'm not risking a liability on top of sabotage." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Edward Soriano gave orders like code was executed without discussion or delay. 2 security officers arrived within seconds. One was already speaking into his earpiece as they entered the room. The lead IT technician was the first to notice. His posture shifted slightly, subtle, but tense. He said nothing. Ronald looked over. As the guards approached, his eyes widened slightly. And he moved. He didn't wait. He didn't ask questions. He stepped between Alma and the approaching officers. A firewall made of flesh, maybe fragile, but standing firm. "She's the only one making progress," Ronald said, loud and clear. His words were like a match struck on dry grass. The first guard froze, caught off guard by Ronald's conviction. The second looked at Edward, waiting for final confirmation. Edward Soriano didn't speak right away. He didn't even look at the guards first. Instead, his eyes locked on Ronald, not just listening to what he'd said, but studying him. The set of his shoulders, the slight tremble in his legs. Even though Ronald was standing tall, his fear was obvious. And yet, he didn't back down. "So what you're telling me," Edward said slowly, "is that you handed control of our critical system recovery to a child." His voice was calm, precise. "A child with no clearance, no formal training, no authorization to be here." Ronald didn't flinch. "I'm telling you," he said firmly, "that she's deeper into the system than any of us have managed to go, and she hasn't tripped a single failsafe." Edward's face was unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes. Was it doubt? Curiosity? Hard to say. But Alma didn't hear any of it. She hadn't noticed Ronald step in front of her. She didn't see the guards hesitate. She was fully immersed in the system, sinking into the logic of the breach, dissecting hidden commands, erasing data traps disguised as harmless functions. Her ability didn't come from coursework. It came from repetition, from breaking things until the patterns emerged like constellations behind smoke. And now she saw it. This breach wasn't random. It was personal. The author of the breach had woven their rage into the code, embedding it into the infrastructure, like a story waiting to be unlocked. Alma didn't panic, but her heart was pounding. This was the moment she had always dreamed of, the kind where solving something meant understanding it, not just fixing it. She was too far inside the system. Her mind was binary now, her thoughts wrapped around logic, flow, and structure. She wasn't waiting for permission. Unlike everyone else in the room, she didn't need to be told to proceed. She was already inside the machine. Her fingers moved on instinct, tapping the keyboard rapidly. She was 3 layers deeper than anyone else had gotten, and what she saw there surprised her. The code wasn't messy. It was exact, almost elegant. This wasn't just a hack. It was intricate, almost poetic, created by someone who wanted it to be found, but only by someone who could read the language. Alma leaned in, pulled by the hidden beauty beneath the danger. It was a quiet masterpiece. There were loops with fake payloads, recursive traps disguised as critical processes, logic trees meant to confuse even the most seasoned engineers. She spotted a small stretch of wrong syntax. It was familiar. Her heart froze, then raced. She'd seen this before. Not this exact code, but something born from the same foundation, the same structure, the same variable patterns. Her mind flew back to a memory, sharp and sudden. She was younger, hiding in the corner of an internet cafe across from her cousin's apartment. Her mum thought she was asleep. Instead, she was crouched in the dark corner of a shop, using a sputtering old laptop to browse abandoned forums filled with dead links and cryptic usernames. There she found a buried thread no one had touched in years. Titled Digital Phantoms, Symmetric Disruption Methods. No replies, just a file dump and one line of text. It's not about opening, it's about being the door. Alma had copied the line by hand into her notebook. She obsessed over the code that came with it for weeks, built it piece by piece on her cousin's desktop, tried, failed, experimented. And now, staring at the screen, she knew. The code in front of her was a descendant of that same logic, a variant, a refined evolution. Too many similarities to ignore. Same error triggers, same hidden logic loops, even the odd variable names, ones that didn't exist in any textbook. This wasn't coincidence. It was a fingerprint. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. The spell of pure logic had been broken by a deep, unsettling sense of recognition. She was no longer dealing with a faceless attacker. She was staring into the work of someone who had walked the same lonely path. She had someone like her, someone who had existed on the outside, in the dark, with no guide or permission. And that changed everything. This wasn't just malicious code, it was a signature. It had come from someone like Alma, someone who had once sat quietly, staring at forbidden lines of code, someone who had learned not from teachers, but through trial and error, through hunger and restlessness. Suddenly, Alma felt something hollow drop in her chest. For the first time, she didn't know whether to be amazed or afraid. Because if someone with a mind like hers had chosen this path, if they'd used their talent to destroy instead of build, what did that say about her? Alma had always believed her unusual way of seeing systems as stories, as rhythms was a gift. But now a frightening question surfaced. What if that same talent could also be dangerous? She leaned back slightly. Her hands, once steady, now trembled. Her thoughts spiraled fear, admiration, confusion, doubt, all tangled in a web she couldn't explain. She had no mentor to ask, no guide to say, what does it mean when the person on the other end of your battle feels like your own echo? Alma's stomach knotted at the thought. This wasn't sloppy or reckless code, it was deliberate, calm, controlled. She looked again at the photo in the frame, Amelia, the smiling girl, and Alma asked herself silently, what would have happened if she hadn't stepped in? Would the system have collapsed? Would private data have been stolen? Or worse, would it all have looked like a random failure? Alma closed her eyes, and for the first time since the breach began, she hesitated. She considered stepping back, letting someone else take over, someone older, more official. Ronald noticed the shift in her. He'd stayed quiet for minutes now, giving Alma space to work, but now he leaned in gently. Alma, he said, careful not to push. She didn't look up. What is it? He asked softly. Did you see something? Alma's voice was quiet but steady. Yes, she said. I think I know who did this. Ronald blinked, confused. You mean like a hacker group? She shook her head slowly. No, she whispered. Someone like me. He didn't respond right away. This wasn't just a breach. It was a message, a test, a riddle placed by someone who expected only one kind of person to find it. Someone like her. And knowing that awakened something inside her, a mix of wonder and fear. What would they do, now that someone was tracing their path? But Alma didn't stop. Even with her hands trembling slightly, she kept going. She wasn't just repairing a system anymore. She was chasing a ghost. But she knew one thing with painful clarity. If someone like that existed, then she had to finish this. Not for Verdant, not for Edward, not even for her mother, for herself, to prove there was another path. Then as tension reached its peak, one of the giant screens flickered. A soft green pulse rippled across the display. A heartbeat. The system began to come back online. People gasped. Someone whispered a curse, half disbelief, half awe. All around her, the room stirred. But Edward Soriano didn't move. He didn't clap, he didn't smile, he didn't speak. He stood in the back, arms crossed tightly, watching the small girl at the terminal, like she had grown straight out of the machine itself. The executives murmured to each other. The engineers looked around as if waking from a bad dream. A manager spun in place, disoriented by the impossibility of what had just happened. But Edward never took his eyes off Alma. All he knew about her was her first name, Alma. No last name, no file, just what his assistant had said. The janitor's daughter. No record of technical training, no digital footprint outside basic building logs. And yet there she was, sitting at a terminal no one else could command. Her hands barely big enough to span the keyboard, solving what an entire department of experts could not. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't forcing it. She understood it. Edward Soriano. A man of numbers. A master of precision. The architect of an entire corporate empire stood frozen. He couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. He said nothing. When Alma finished typing and stepped back, she clutched her old notebook to her chest. She didn't meet anyone's eyes, not even Ronald's, whose trembling hand now rested gently on her shoulder in quiet recognition. Someone handed her a bottle of water. Another person mumbled something about reporting to the board, but Edward, he turned away, quietly, heavy steps echoing through the room, his thoughts louder than any alarm. He returned to his office like a man, his steps slow, his fists clenched tighter than he realized. When he reached his desk, he didn't speak. He waved his assistant away with a glance and shut the door. Alone, he pulled up the security archives. The footage had already been tagged the exact timestamp from when Alma sat down at the terminal to the moment the system came back to life. He watched in silence. The screen flipped through frame after frame. There she was, focused, still. Her lips moved faintly. Her fingers moved with precision, no hesitation. What struck him most wasn't just what she did, but how she did it. Quiet, steady, centered in the eye of the storm. And then something surfaced in Edward's mind. A memory long buried. Years ago, behind an orphanage in Abilene. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, sitting alone with a broken radio in her lap, fingers stained with grease, trying to bring it back to life. She rarely spoke, but she was always there. Every day after school, when he used to stop by to deliver things or handle repairs. No company, no future. Once she'd told him, "If I can fix the radio, maybe I'll hear voices from a better place." And one day, the wires sparked. She laughed, just laughed. He remembered standing behind her, stunned. And then one day she was gone. No goodbye, no explanation. He never asked what happened. He didn't want to know. He buried it like so many things that didn't fit the path he'd chosen. He convinced himself that forgetting was strength, that moving forward meant severing what couldn't keep up. But now watching Alma, paused mid-frame in the security feed, something cracked inside him. The shape of her shoulders, the way she held her fear. It wasn't just talent, it was familiar. He turned away from the screen, folded his hands beneath his chin, eyes locked on the frozen image of Alma in motion. Edward Soriano wasn't someone who startled easily. He had faced investor wars, PR disasters, billion-dollar negotiations, but he hadn't been prepared for this. Not for the image of a girl sitting calmly in the center of a digital collapse, doing what no one else could. Not for someone who hadn't done it for money or praise, but simply because she could. And now, the question that haunted him wasn't just what she had done, but what it meant. How had he become the kind of person who nearly ordered security to remove a child just because she didn't fit the image of intelligence? When had he decided that people could only be measured by resume badges and curated profiles? When had he forgotten that sometimes the sharpest minds came from the quietest corners? Alma had returned that part to him with her hands on a keyboard. He rewatched the footage, slower this time, not for the code, for her. The way she moved, her intention, and then a single frame held him in place, her hand gently resting on the edge of the machine, as if she were listening, feeling its heartbeat. And again, the image of the girl with the radio rose up, the one who disappeared without anyone noticing. Would Alma disappear too, now that the moment had passed? Would anyone fight to keep her seen? Edward's chest tightened. He already knew the answer. If he left her alone, the world would bury her brilliance in silence and bureaucracy. Unless someone refused, unless he refused. Not as a CEO, but as a man who once watched a girl vanish because no one thought to reach for her. Alma hadn't just cracked his network, she'd cracked him. And now, in the quiet, glass-walled corner of his office, surrounded by luxury, accolades, and everything he once believed mattered, Edward Soriano faced a question no spreadsheet could answer. What should he do with the girl who broke his certainty? The next morning, She was brought back in. No formal invitation, no car service, no speech. Just a quiet request, relayed secretly to her mother by a night supervisor. Alma didn't ask questions. She never did. She packed the way she always packed, making sure her old notebook was inside her backpack, that her worn-out sneakers still fit, and that the same oversized hoodie, with frayed cuffs slipping over her fingers, was enough. This time, her mother didn't walk her in. She stood at the door, expression uneasy, lips pressed tight as Alma walked alone through the glass doors. A polite assistant met her, guiding her through quiet hallways to a conference room with a long table and a single blue chair at the end. No greetings, no smiles, no one pretending she was a guest. The tone had changed. They no longer treated her like a child. They treated her like something new, something they didn't fully understand. Alma sat down quietly. The room smelled of lemon polish and industrial cleaner. It was the same scent her mom brought home every night. People arrived one by one, not the whole crowd from the day before, just a few key figures. Ronald included. He held a notebook and offered a small, steady smile. That helped. An older woman with short hair and square glasses sat across from Alma and jumped right in. "How did you do it?" Alma blinked. "Which part?" A pause. Then a few people laughed, not unkindly, but with genuine respect. A soft voice clarified. "The override, the recursive tracking, the nested breach detection, all of it." Alma gripped her pencil. The old fear crept back in, the one that told her adults didn't want her truth, only confirmation of theirs. But this time, no one interrupted. No one mocked. They were actually listening. Slowly, she turned and said, "I don't really know how to explain it in words." Silence followed, not the kind that stifles, but the kind that makes space. Alma pulled out her notebook, flipped to a blank page. "But I can show you." Her pencil moved carefully across the paper. Head bent, focused. The room watched in silence. She wasn't drawing code, not exactly. It wasn't a blueprint either. It was something in between. Branches that resembled circuits, loops that flowed like rivers, shapes that evoked weather systems patterns, only visible if you looked at systems the way she did. No labels, no annotations. She wasn't explaining. She was constructing, the way she always did, mapping her mind into form. After several minutes, she stopped, rotated the page, and gently pushed it across the table. For a moment, no one moved. Then Edward reached forward, arms tucked in, eyes careful. He pulled the paper toward himself. He didn't ask what it meant. He studied it, not like a boss reviewing a report, but like a man looking for a secret beneath the surface. Alma watched him closely, not because she expected praise she never did, but because this wasn't about approval. Edward turned the page, looked again, then stopped. His hands rested lightly on the edge, and Alma saw the change in his posture, the silent recognition in the way his shoulders shifted. He understood, not the drawing itself, but what it was. Not a schematic, a map. She hadn't shown him data. She'd shown him herself, in the only language that had ever made sense to her. And he understood. Others in the room lowered their heads, aware that something had landed, even if they couldn't quite name it. But Alma knew. Edward wasn't analyzing anymore. He was remembering something Alma couldn't see but could feel in the sudden quietness of his gaze. He no longer looked at her as unusual or extraordinary, but as someone whose way of thinking he had once known himself, someone he had once been. Alma shifted slightly in her seat, unsure, soft-spoken. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected to be in a room where silence didn't feel like a threat, but like wonder. She reached for her notebook to take it back, but paused when Edward lifted his eyes. His expression had changed, not out of pity, out of understanding. He tapped the page once and asked, "What do you call this loop?" Alma shrugged slightly. It doesn't really have a name, she said. It's just how I stop everything from collapsing when the system turns inward on itself. Edward nodded slowly. That's what happened yesterday, wasn't it? She hesitated, then answered calmly. Yes. He placed the drawing gently back on the table. Keep this, he said. Don't change it. Alma tucked the page carefully back into her notebook like it was nothing, but inside her heart was pounding. For the first time, she didn't just feel like she'd solved a problem. She felt like she'd spoken and someone had heard. When she gave him the drawing, Edward hadn't looked at it as a chart or a file. He'd rotated it, studied it, understood what it really was. But instead of returning to his office, Edward gave a new instruction to his driver. No security escort, no assistant with trembling hands and a folder of bullet points. Because what he needed now couldn't be found in documents. It waited somewhere his executive team had never been. He stepped out of the taxi at the end of a narrow street. The air felt different here. Not because of the place, but because for the first time in years, he was walking into a space where no one expected anything from him. He had to ask twice before someone pointed him to the right door. When it opened, Alma's mother stood there, a broom in one hand, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Are you Mr. Soriano?" she asked, barely audible. The first thing she felt wasn't pride, but panic. Had she done something wrong? She hadn't meant to. Edward gently cut her off. "You did everything right," he said. "I just want to see her world." And it was true. But still, her mother hesitated, watching him like she expected a trap. Inside, Alma sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by wires, resistors, and loose parts scattered across a tray. She didn't stand up, didn't look surprised. She looked up, then held out a cracked, old radio. "Can you fix this? No small talk, no greetings, just a direct challenge." Edward accepted the radio carefully, studying the damage like an artifact. "I used to," he said, "many years ago." "Try," she replied, handing him an old screwdriver like she was passing a torch. He knelt beside her. His knees ached more than he wanted to admit. He started removing the panel. His hands were stiff, trained by boardrooms, not back rooms. Alma said nothing. She just watched, patient. Her mother stood in the background, unsure whether to stay or leave. Then a small boy burst out of the kitchen, holding a fork and an empty plate. "Is there more?" he called. "If someone flips it next, it's yours." Alma shouted back. "Your turn, Daniel." He grumbled but ran toward the stove without protest. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Your brother?" "Cousin," she replied. "He lives here now. Pretty much everyone does." It explained the mattress against the wall, the dishes stacked in a bucket, the 3 toothbrushes in a single plastic cup by the door. Daniel flipped the edge of a pancake, while Alma's mother explained they only used the middle burner on the stove, the other ones sparked. Edward sat on the floor with the broken radio in his lap, and felt a kind of energy he hadn't touched in years. He watched Alma kneel beside Daniel, pointing at a capacitor on a breadboard. "If it's weak," she said, "the charge loops before the signal clears. You have to match the resistance." "Not fair," Daniel groaned. "I don't even know what resistance is." "Then learn," she said, without flinching. "That's how I did it." Edward didn't say a word. He just watched. The living room was a workshop, an organized mess of wires, salvaged hardware, sketched diagrams, and handmade circuits. Everything built from scraps, every skill earned through trying. And Edward realized what he had seen at the terminal wasn't formal training. It was survival. After his third failed attempt to replace a tiny transistor, Edward finally asked, "Where'd you learn all this?" Alma held up a fused-together switchboard and shrugged. "Nowhere," she said. "It just started to make sense, like math, but with sparks." Then she pointed at Daniel. He didn't even know what a diode was 2 weeks ago. Now he can test polarity without burning his fingers. "That was once," Daniel yelled from the stove. "Big deal," Alma muttered, and Edward laughed, really laughed. For the first time since all this began, he hadn't expected to feel that. "You didn't wait to be taught," Edward said quietly. Alma nodded. "I couldn't," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, no edge, just truth. She didn't say it with resentment, almost like she hadn't even noticed how unusual it was, and that more than anything stuck with him. She hadn't acted like someone who'd been denied. She'd acted like someone who had accepted the rules of the world and quietly rewritten them. Later, while eating uneven pancakes, Edward looked around the room again. Cracked tile on the floor, exposed wires, a ceiling fan that rattled but didn't spin. But that wasn't what stayed with him. It was the clarity, how every object in the space had a purpose. Every surface was claimed by learning. Alma had built a lab out of leftovers and a classroom out of silence. And most astonishing of all, she'd done it without becoming bitter. No resentment, no chip on her shoulder. Just a quiet, relentless hunger to know. Before leaving, she handed him a small piece of paper, a drawing from her notebook. There were doodles of pancakes in the margins, but at the center a circuit diagram, hand-sketched with perfect precision. "I figured out how to bake emergency power," she said. "No batteries, just a charge buffer." Edward didn't know how to respond. Here was a kid pulling energy from broken machines and translating it into her own language. He was stunned not just by her brilliance, but by her humility. She hadn't waited to be discovered. She'd become too smart to ignore, and somehow she had done it without anger, like a flower pushing through concrete. Edward left her home that night with a weight in his chest he couldn't name. It followed him back to his office, clung to him during a board call he barely heard. It stayed with him while legal advisors talked about liability and risk. But his mind wasn't in the room. It was with a sketch of a power loop stained with syrup, drawn by a girl who hadn't asked for attention, but had changed everything he knew about potential. The next morning, before employees arrived, he rewrote Verdant's internship policy. Minimum age, removed. GPA requirements, adjusted. Digital portfolios and background checks, optional. He didn't wait for approval. He was the approval. Then he called legal again this time to set up a scholarship fund. Not for top scorers or prep school prodigies, but for minds like Alma's, raw, unpolished, brilliant, seen by all, but noticed by none. And finally, in a move no one expected, he renamed the company's internal firewall. Not after himself, not after the brand. He called it, "Elia Protect, a quiet tribute to the girl who stepped into chaos and stilled it, while grown men panicked." But even as he signed off on all these changes, he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. It wasn't wrong, just unfinished. Because what Alma had offered wasn't just a solution, it was a mirror, a question, a memory. And no policy could answer that. Only he could. So he picked up the phone. No assistant, no gatekeeper. He made the call himself. And when Alma's mother answered, her voice cautious, he asked if they were willing to come in. Not for a formality, not for ceremony. Just to talk. There was a pause, a deep breath, and then a yes, shaky, but sincere. When they arrived, he didn't lead them to a side office. He brought them straight into the boardroom, the place where strategies were written, where futures were decided. He wanted Alma to see that there was space for her here. Not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She didn't look impressed. In fact, she looked a little bored. But she sat down, notebook in hand, as always. Her mother sat beside her, tense, clutching her purse like it might vanish if she let go. Edward cleared his throat. Once, twice, 3 times, and finally spoke softly, but with certainty. "You changed the way we think here." he told Alma. Not just about our systems, but about our people, our definition of talent, of leadership, of what intelligence looks like. You walked into a room full of failure, and you didn't hesitate. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't ask for credit. You just solved it. Her mother tried to smile, but her eyes filled with tears almost immediately. Edward looked at them both, this girl and the woman who raised her, and continued. I've made some changes, he said. There's a scholarship in your name now. We're launching a real mentorship program, hands-on, one-to-one. You'll have full access to labs, hardware, everything you need to keep learning and building. Alma's mother let out a breath, a sound caught between a sob and an exhale. She covered her mouth with one hand. But Alma didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply tilted her head, as if processing Edward's words like input, calm, assessing if it was real. I want to bring you on site, Edward added, not as a visitor, as part of the team if you want it. He paused, and for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. What if she said no? What if she brushed this off like it meant nothing? Alma looked at her mother, then back at Edward. Her voice was quiet. Can I still break things? It wasn't fear behind the question, it was clarity. Breaking things was her language, her way of understanding systems. If this opportunity came with boundaries that would restrict that process, she would walk away. Edward blinked, then smiled, not the corporate smile, not the political one, a real smile. Her mother wept openly now, head bowed, tears streaming freely. Alma didn't rush to comfort her, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't need to. Silently, she reached across the table and took her mother's hand. That was enough. The room grew quiet, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was full, complete. Edward stood slowly. He reached into a folder beside him and slid something across the table. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a job description. It was a badge, white with a red trim, Verdant Technologies in the corner, and one word beneath it, Alma, full access. You can start tomorrow, he said, or next week, or next month. It's yours whenever you're ready. Alma took it without a word, turned it once in her fingers, felt its weight. I'll come tomorrow, she said. Edward nodded and turned toward the window. There was something tight in his chest, something burning just behind his eyes, because he knew what had truly happened. He hadn't just offered her something. She had offered him something too, a second chance, to build a legacy that wasn't just impressive to investors, but that meant something real. The system had survived the breach, but more than that, it had gained something it didn't know it was missing. And in that same boardroom, where he'd told her about the mentorship, and her mother had cried, Alma had asked, "Can I still break things?" He had smiled. Yes, that's how we find out what's inside. The rhythm of work. The months passed, not in headlines or hype, but in quiet, steady change, the kind that lasts. Alma became part of Verdant, not as a novelty, not as a symbol, as a presence. Every morning she still rode the bus with her mother side by side in the front row. Still more silence than conversation. She still wore the same oversized hoodie, its sleeves patched and repatched. Her notebook had grown now 2 of them, thicker, filled with blueprints, questions, and sketches of machines she hadn't shown anyone yet. Her badge white with a red trim read, Alma M., no last name. She didn't need one. She had her own corner in the lab, not an office, a space others didn't touch. Above her workstation, someone had scrawled with permanent marker, Alma's brain. No one told her it was hers. She didn't erase it, and she liked it there. Engineers brought her snacks. Interns asked her opinion. Team leads paused outside her station not to check in, but to watch. She didn't perform. She didn't explain. She worked. And the difference now? People saw it. And maybe more importantly, She saw it. She was no longer an outsider staring at someone else's machine. She was the machine, helping to shape it from the inside. Her voice carried weight now. When she suggested an improvement to the company's data funneling system, no one doubted her. The engineering team implemented it. When she identified a flaw in a third-party security module and flagged it to the vendors, no one dismissed her. But at home, nothing changed. She still scanned the sidewalks for broken toys on her walk from the bus stop, still hunted for discarded radios and old calculators, still opened them like treasure maps, pulling secrets from forgotten circuits. Her mother no longer asked if she was tired. She just placed a cup of tea beside her and let her work. Their apartment hadn't grown in size, but something inside it had. A new energy in the air, a quiet rhythm of belief. One afternoon, after a long debugging sprint, Alma found a small box waiting at her workstation. It wasn't wrapped, no bow, just a plain label, from R. She opened it carefully. Inside, a screwdriver, old, worn handle, metal tip slightly dulled, but it was clean, cared for, respected. Underneath, a sticky note. You dropped this the first day. I borrowed it. Now it's yours again. No signature. She didn't need one. She smiled just a little and tucked the screwdriver into her backpack alongside her notebooks. That night, at home, she added a small shelf above her workbench, placed the screwdriver there, carefully, centered, not as a tool, as a reminder of the moment the system broke and she didn't, of the moment she was finally seen and never again forgotten, of the moment she stopped asking if there was a place for her and started building one with her own hands. Later, as she drifted into sleep, she heard Daniel tinkering at the kitchen table. He was muttering to himself, frustrated, trying to make something light up. Alma didn't get up. She just shouted from the other room, "Try reversing the leads. You'll figure it out." A pause, then a small zap, a tiny spark, and finally, a shout of victory. She smiled again, closed her eyes, and let the sound of curiosity carry her into the dark, where her mind could finally rest. The end. Thank you for watching. This is Mr. Hope. Subscribe and comment.